Well, we're less than 1 week from the presidential election. Things could go really crazy in one direction or really crazy in another. Either way, I do think it's going to be a crazy week. To help me go through that and some of the biggest stories, I have Kim Strassel. Kim, thank you so much for joining me again.
Hi, Stephen. It's a pleasure, as always.
So just some background for my audience. Kim is an author, conservative columnist. She sits on the Wall Street Journal's editorial board. She's covered big stories like the Russia Collusion story. And President Trump publicly said she deserves a Pulitzer Prize for her writing.
2 reasons I'll never get it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, hey, why'd you have to say something, you know? So, I want to just jump right into Biden. You've written a book about Biden, his family, the Biden Malaise. If Trump gets into office, do you see him seeking justice on behalf of the United States for the Biden family, peddling influence to China and Ukraine and Romania and other places? Or does he take the high road like he did with Hillary Clinton and say, listen, we just need to move on as a country?
Look, I have to tell you, I was really surprised the other day, and maybe no one should be surprised, that Donald Trump was specifically asked about Hunter Biden. And he said that he would be open to pardoning Hunter Biden, which is notable because it does suggest that not only is he not interested in going down this road of going after people who came after him, but that he understands that all of this drama and things in the Department of Justice are undermining faith in that institution. Look, one thing that I always point to people is, despite all of these Democratic claims constantly that somehow the Department of Justice was politicized under Trump, the situation is exactly opposite. Bill Barr was there and Jeff Sessions for most of that time, and they ran a pretty straightforward shop. In fact, what they were trying to do was tamp down on some of the congressional shenanigans. Remember the Mueller probe, the special counsel that had been appointed under Rod Rosenstein, trying to get answers to that, but also not escalate the drama. And I think there's good reason to believe that those around Donald Trump make the argument that the problem these days is too much politicization of the law and that you need to step back from it.
Yeah. Yeah, I wondered. I did see that about Hunter Biden, and honestly, if Trump didn't go after Hillary, I don't see him going after a former president once Biden has left office. I think he wants to tamp things down, cool down the rhetoric. He doesn't want to become a third world country where you go after your political enemies, even though they've gone after him. The one area, though, that I do wonder if he might open a probe or go down this road is the 51 former intelligence agents that lied to the American people about the Hunter Biden laptop. The reason I say that is, during the Joe Rogan interview with Donald Trump, he specifically brought up how I think it was between 15 and 19% of Democrats said if they had known about that disgusting laptop, that they would not have voted for Joe Biden. And that was one of the primary reasons he felt like the 2020 election was not upstanding or the way that he wanted. Do you see him going after those 51, or at least investigating whether they should lose their security clearance?
I think what I have heard, to the extent that there is interest in this, I think it really does have to do with what was discovered in some of the congressional probes looking at this, which is that you had people who were active duty intelligence, who were supposedly helping those retired intelligence agents get information or coordinate with each other. That was concerning because we do expect our active duty intelligence people to be nonpartisan, to not be engaged in elections. I think this has also inspired a big discussion about security clearances after the flat fact, and how much information people can continue to obtain, especially if they are TV analysts or commentators, that this is their second career. Why on earth? Maybe you shouldn't also be allowed to have your top secret clearance and be bringing in all those fancy contracts as private consultants for people, or being on television and talking about it. And I do think that those are worthy policy areas that definitely deserve a little bit more scrutiny and attention, mostly not to go after anyone who did it already, but rather to further ensure that we don't do it again.
Yeah. I always found it curious that, people leave, but then they're like still given this magic back door to areas that are supposed to be top secret. It served a purpose for you to have that clearance at one point, but now 10, 15 years later, you're just milking it in the private sector for a higher paying 6-figure job. So it'll be interesting if they revise that or revoke anybody's license.
And one thing on that too, which I just think is, some people, I just want to throw in there, some people have good reason to go. Some people will leave their government job where they have a security clearance, and they'll go, for instance, to work for a defense contractor where they're working on next stage military equipment, and they really do need that classified holding in order to continue doing that work. That's one thing. But I think that there's a lot of people that just go into private practice and say, hey, I can advise you on this stuff. And I just think there needs to be a higher bar for the scrutiny.
Yeah, I agree. What, there's been a lot of chatter and talk and views from this Joe Rogan, Donald Trump interview. There's talk about whether YouTube is censoring it or not. Joe Rogan says he doesn't think so, but then he kicked it over to X so that it could be completely unfettered. What were your thoughts on some of the interactions between Joe Rogan and the former president?
It's funny. I've been thinking about this a lot, Stephen, because I don't know that I am the best person to analyze that particular conversation. For me, because I'm constantly going work, and I'm used to the 10-second sound bites and what can people get in a 40-minute stump speech. To sit there for 3 hours and have these guys just sort of go back and forth, it seemed like very long. But I have to say, one, I'm not that podcast target audience. It's men. And two, Rogan has always been very clear that he does this format on purpose, these 3-hour conversations, because he wants to talk to someone and get to know them as a human being and just rap about different subjects. And if you go through the comments, for those people who actually managed to find the YouTube video in the end and watch it. And by the way, I just checked it earlier today. It's already got 35 million views. So it's getting viewed.
Wow.
But they like that. They like that interaction. You could see it in the comments. People were like, I love this discussion and this is fascinating. And I've never heard Trump talk about this before. So I would wager overall it was a help to him. I thought that there was a lot of meandering. At one point, he was explaining how he likes to weave in and out of subjects. And Joe Rogan said, your weave's getting a bit broad here, like bring it back. But yeah, I think it probably did aid him, especially with the target audience that Trump is trying to reach at the moment.
Yeah, he did weave.
He weaved.
He was weaving quite a lot. And, I think it's his particular style. I think it's why he can give a 90-minute speech and Kamala Harris can give a 7-minute speech. He loves to storytell. He loves to give background. He likes to set up a joke and then knock it down. And so I felt like the interview made him incredibly human. And I think the sound bites that a lot of us are used to on X or on the internet, they give you a snapshot of who he is. But then if you have a bunch of chatter from the mainstream media telling you who he is or what to think about that, I wonder if maybe that has led to some of the mystery of who Donald Trump really is, how they can get away with saying he's Hitler. But then you sit down and you listen to a 3-hour conversation and you go, this guy's like the opposite of Hitler. He's just a charming businessman. He's had a lot of failures in his life, which I believe he's done his best to learn from. He's also had a tremendous amount of success in his life, which I think he's also tried to learn from. But at the end of the day, he's a businessman that cares a lot about leaving a better country to his children and grandchildren. Was there any particular part of that interview that you've read about or watched that stuck out to you? Listen up, homeowners. When is the last time you checked the title on your house? You know, the legal document proving that you own it? If your answer is never, you should know about a fast-growing scam the FBI calls house stealing. It's shockingly easy for criminals to forge a document called a quitclaim deed. They transfer the home out of your name into their own, and you don't even know it's happened. Here's how it works. Scammers create a fake version of your signature, buy a notary stamp online, and take it down to the county recorder, and boom, suddenly your house no longer belongs to you. But guess what? They're not after your house. They want the equity or the money in your house. They cleverly take out loans against your house, leaving you with a financial and legal nightmare. But you can protect yourself from this devastating scam with triple lock protection from HomeTitleLock.com. Start by checking if your title is still in your name. Visit HomeTitleLock.com and enter your address for a free title scan. Now, you're going to need to use promo code Gardner, but this will also get you a free 30-day trial of triple lock protection. Don't wait. Visit HomeTitleLock.com today and use code Gardner for that free 30-day trial.
Well, by the way, I couldn't agree with you more about this particular format for him and how good it was for him to engage in it. And the fact that a lot of people just don't really know Donald Trump. And I wonder sometimes if his campaign hasn't made a couple of huge errors in not actually putting him in that environment more, because as you know, what he prefers to do are these set pieces where he's the showman, you know, and showman performance doesn't give a lot of room for getting below the mask, right? That, and then the other ones he does is with media, where he feels as though he's in a hostile environment, and so he's very aggressive in those situations. And this sort of, look, I've had the opportunity to meet him before, and one thing that comes through, and that I think came through consistently, you were asking about pieces in there, is that when Donald Trump says he wants to make America great again, he's not joking. Like, he actually deeply cares about the United States of America. And it actually explains a great deal of his policies. And I mean, it's not just a slogan. It's like why he gets angry about trade, because he feels that other countries are taking advantage of the United States of America. It's why he gets frustrated that NATO isn't spending more money on its own security, because he feels like the United States is being taken for granted. And I feel as though that doesn't always come through. He sort of says these things, and the press will turn those statements into, well, he's xenophobic, he hates foreigners. I think those are two sides of that's not exactly capturing what he is. He's more extremely proudly American. And that came through, I think, in his show, in the show.
Yeah. I agree with you. Like maybe 9 months ago, I remember saying to my wife, I really feel like Donald Trump should be getting on these podcasts, because even though he likes to brag about getting 40,000 people in a stadium, he can reach 4 million people on a podcast. He has more time to develop a topic, explain tariffs, or the reason that, having a secure border is important. The reason that we need a strong military, he needs time to develop those. Maybe not, the long weave, but enough time. And the person that really made me think about that was actually RFK Jr. He said, I think this election cycle, podcasts are the unique thing that will set somebody apart. And then he talked about how TV was just kind of becoming popular around the time JFK was running, and that they leveraged that to get his face familiar with people. And same thing. So I'm glad that Trump is doing that. I think maybe Barron Trump had something to do with that, because he was saying, hey, you got to get on TikTok. You got to get on some of these younger people's show and show them who you really are. Right now, they just think of you as like an old grandpa. They don't know what you can do. So I was grateful to see him do that. And of course, we've got JD Vance doing Rogan. Why do you think they are working so hard to actively keep Kamala Harris away from an interview? Just the worry that in 2 hours she would definitely flub in some way?
Well, it's 3 hours. And, and I think that is a part of it. And I'm really struck, Stephen, by these conspiracy theories out there right now that Joe Rogan is trying to keep her off his show, and he's showing favoritism and doing something for Trump. And why won't he just pack up his studio and fly across the country and meet her somewhere for an hour? Because those are the conditions, apparently, her campaign laid out. We don't have time to come to Texas to see you, and we only want to do an hour. And he, I thought, put out a very reasonable explanation, Rogan did. And he just very calmly said, look, we've been negotiating this. I think the studio is the appropriate place to do it. And I think 3 hours, like doing a longer episode, is what allows you to have a conversation with someone. And by the way, I'm looking forward to it. I hope she'll make the time. Like, I'd really love to sit down and find out what she's like as a human being. He was very polite, very generous about it. But I think, they don't want to take time off the road. Okay, Trump did. He flew to Texas and did this. In fact, I think he made a stadium full of Michigan people wait for him because he ran over and it took a while to get there. But, he made that strategic decision. She needs to make that strategic decision if she wants to go. But I think you've also hit on something. 3 hours of unfiltered Kamala Harris, I don't know what you get from that. And what we have seen in these closing weeks is they decided to make her more available to the media, and it's not worked out well for them. The polls are showing that her unfavorability ratings have gone up, and that is probably a function of why you see this slow and small but very steady drift in the polls toward Trump and Republicans in the final weeks.
Yes. You're in journalism. There's a story out right now that I was actually impressed by. Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post many years ago, and I guess it has a reputation for being a Democrat mouthpiece, and I don't fully disagree with that. But he refused to allow the Washington Post to endorse Kamala Harris. Well, now he's come out and said, one, I don't believe endorsing her is going to help her win. And two, I'm actually hiring a bunch of conservative journalists. We need to be more balanced. We need to be more about telling the news and the truth and not getting caught in our echo chamber. And whining about things isn't successful, and complaining isn't a strategy. If we're going to survive in an industry that's lost credibility and feels very lopsided, we have to do that by taking action to show both sides. What are your thoughts on him being open about that?
I thought it was a very strong op-ed that he wrote. It was one of those op-eds you look at, and if you're in the journalism business, you say, wow, I wish we'd had that. That was good. But I find all of this somewhat amusing, I have to say. I mean, just the utter meltdown within the Washington Post. You've had resignations. You've had this group of 20 Washington Post opinion writers voice their objection and talk about how they had a moral duty to call out Trump and endorse Kamala Harris. Here's the thing that I thought was most important about Jeff Bezos's op-ed that he ran. And by the way, a little tiny pitch, I have a newsletter that's coming out every week now on Wednesdays. Okay. I'm going to have a little item about this tomorrow in case anybody wants to look. But the most important point he made is endorsements don't matter, okay? What he didn't say, but what he might have said is they really are little more these days than like a kind of vanity measure by journalists, to sort of to prove their own bona fides or just to get their opinion out there. There was a really interesting analysis done by the Hill newspaper back in 2016, right before the election, looking at all the top newspapers in the country. 57 of them endorsed Hillary Clinton. 2 of them endorsed Donald Trump. And you can see what that got her, what that earned her. I mean, endorsements, they don't matter. The other thing is this is simply the Washington Post joining a trend of newspapers that are not endorsing anymore. By the way, my newspaper has not endorsed a presidential candidate since 1928. But Gannett, the largest newspaper owner in the country, just this week said none of its 200 newspapers are going to endorse anymore. That includes USA Today. 2 years ago, the second largest newspaper owner, Alden, said that its 200 organizations, which involve like the Chicago Tribune and the Denver Post, would not be endorsing in presidential races. Even the New York Times earlier this year said that while it will continue to do presidential endorsements, it will not do state level endorsements anymore, which is sort of an interesting shift. And the stated reason by a lot of the owners of these publications is that in a 50-50 country where we are so divided, all you're doing is throwing kind of more gasoline on the fire, especially if it doesn't result in any real change in the electoral outcome, by the way, too. And I thought that was the thing that Bezos also added to is he didn't really he did say endorsements don't matter. He made that point. But he also said that one of the problems is that you end up just showing your cards, you looking more biased, and that newspapers, unfortunately, too many mainstream newspapers these days have a reputation for being on one side.
Yeah. No, I hear you. Thank you for your feedback. I was as I read that, I thought about you. I thought, oh, what would somebody high up at the Wall Street Journal think of that? So, thank you for that. I don't know if you've seen this or not, but there is a video going around Twitter, getting millions of views. It's of Attorney General Kamala Harris of California. She's openly bragging about destroying families, destroying lives, specifically targeting Black mothers, how with the stroke of a pen, she could ruin someone's life and then 2 weeks later undo it, but the damage is done and they would now comply or behave the way she wanted to. And it all came down to if your kids missed too much school, truancy, then the state of California lost out on money. And she said, I want that money. And so, but she openly brags about ruining so many families' lives. I don't know if you've seen that or if you know that story.
I've been seeing some, and there was an interesting article about this, which might also be behind everyone talking about it at the moment, where it actually profiled a mother who'd been swept into this. And her child had, according to her, a very serious disease, which required absence from school, and that she claimed she'd actually dealt with the school administration on this question, that they were understanding of the scenario, but she got swept up in this anyway, and it was very much about what had happened to her life as a result, and it was very unpleasant. I find this interesting because Kamala Harris is out obviously bragging. One of her biggest points that she makes all the time, she opens with it in nearly every event, is I'm a prosecutor. I was a tough go get 'em prosecutor. Of course, I have always wondered about that because it's a bit of a double-edged sword, especially among progressive voting communities who, for instance, don't particularly like aggressive prosecution on questions of drug-related crimes, for instance, petty crimes. I mean, we've seen what's happened in California. I disagree with that somewhat, but this has obviously been her pitch to, in particular, moderate or independent or just right of center voters who wonder if she's tough enough to be president. But I think it puts out the peril of standing on that too much as people are now looking at her history and background and what in particular she did with that position in California.
Yeah, she does brag about that, or she, during the debate, I'm the only one on the stage that's gone after a international crime syndicate or something like that. But again, I don't know that helps you because at the same time, the Democrat Party, throws a lot of shade towards police, justice not being fair or blind, racial targeting, things like that. And yet she played a major role in that. And again, she openly brags in this video about targeting Black mothers because they were the ones that she could get to comply the easiest. So I wanted to show that video, but I worried about a copyright situation, especially because it had music in the background. YouTube is very, very cautious about music. So let's talk about illegal immigration for a second. I want to bring up two things from two big names. First, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont said, importing a bunch of workers from other countries would make the American worker poorer. This maybe works for the Cook brothers, but not for the American people. And then Kamala Harris's own father, Professor Harris, said illegal immigration drives down wages by bringing in low-skilled workers. Illegal workers working is especially bad for the Black worker. Why is Kamala Harris so unconcerned with flooding the United States of America with illegal immigrants?
So remember, Stephen, that this became an article of faith about 5 years ago among progressive communities. I'm not going to ascribe one motive to their view. Remember, and it was voiced loudly by nearly every person standing on the stage during the Democratic primary debate in 2019, was that we should decriminalize border crossings, meaning, in essence, that we should not have a border. Anybody who wants to come across should just be able to come across. Now, I would say that the charitable argument for that is that there are some out there that believe that the conditions in other countries are so terrible that America has a moral obligation to take any asylum that comes to it. I would argue that from a practical standpoint, that is absolutely unrealistic, and no country survives long if it doesn't have sovereign borders. I think that there is another contingent that has believed that if you let these people through, they are a new pool of voters that will benefit the Democratic Party. That to me is a little bit of a tougher bet sometimes, because what we were seeing, especially in recent election cycles, is that while newer immigrants often sometimes are Democratic voters, minority communities in this country, in particular immigrant communities in this country, the longer they're here, they often do tend to migrate more toward Republican candidates. So that's an interesting change. But I think that's sort of the argument behind it, and that she is in hock to her progressive left, which still demands that their candidates have this view.
Okay. Do you think it's weird that her dad lives like 2 miles from her in Washington, D.C., and he never gives any praise or feedback. He never openly discusses. He's never visited anything. He's never attended anything. Maybe just he's a private person. I don't know. It seems so strange.
Family dynamics. I don't go into family dynamics. We all have those family dynamics. And so, I wouldn't hazard a guess.
Yeah. Okay. Sticking with the, importing future voters, Elon Musk said today, Biden and Harris's program of importing future voters is their best performing program. I know he was being tongue in cheek, but he was also trying to highlight the fact that we can't have this many people coming in. It's going to affect schools, hospitals, our social safety net programs. Senator Marco Rubio pointed out on the floor of Congress recently that you have illegal immigrants coming in, getting better financial benefits than Americans that have given 40 years of work and service to their country. What are your thoughts on Elon Musk kind of jokingly saying it's one of their best performing programs?
Well, if it was indeed the goal, they haven't done a pretty good job of it. Look, I have to be honest with you. I mean, first of all, I think in a way that the media actually has in some ways not helped Kamala Harris here. If you go back to that Trump-Harris debate, the enormous amount of attention that was paid after that debate to Trump's comments about the pet eating in Ohio and, the fact checking, and that's not true. And this is all of that ended up becoming a kind of sideline to the fact that it resurrected in so many voters' heads that this immigration problem is now nationwide and that it's putting stress on communities in every single state. On very finite resources, whether, as you say, education, whether it's food support, whether it's emergency services, whether it's the police department, and in a nation that already has a more than $6 trillion budget and obviously has enormous financial problems coming down the road in terms of debt and spending. This is something that you have to have a hard look at and make a change on. I have to be honest with you that the thing that's frustrating for me is somebody as a free market person who believes in flexible, smart labor policy and immigration policy. The biggest damage Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have done is to make everybody just want all immigration to stop. And I agree that we absolutely have to close the border to this, what's going on at the moment. But I fear that we have now moved out of the realm of anybody having an intelligent discussion about what our asylum policy really should look like, what we should do in terms of sort of getting the best people who come to this country, the ones with the PhDs, the ones, how do we get rid of chain migration, which is just you get in and your whole family gets to come behind you, versus getting the kind of, the superstars out there who we know are going to contribute to the American economy. What about a program where you can have migrant workers who really don't want to live in this country? They just want to work here on a seasonal basis for jobs that, by the way, sometimes do go wanting because Americans won't do them, and go back home at the end of the summer and take their wages with them. We used to have some thoughts about how that might work. Nobody's having a discussion about that anymore. And I truly believe it's because, I know it's because they so allowed the mess at the border over the last 3 years, and it has so soured Americans on anything to do with immigration at all. And I get it. But I think it's set back the cause of a smart policy discussion about this for a long, long time.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is there's that story of, the python that swallows something, and there's this big, bowl of food going through. Like, now you've got asylum seekers, they don't even have a court date for 7 to 10 years. So do you say, hey, no new people while we clear out the court system for 7 to 10 years? Or do you do an executive order that forces people's hands, such as, hey, you still have your court date, but we're not going to use taxpayer money to let you live here for 7 years. Go back home, or you run out of money. I don't know. There has to be a way, because I think in most Americans' hearts, they take pride in the fact that we're a nation of immigrants.
Yes.
But they are turned off by being a nation of illegal immigrants, especially where they're getting better benefits being here for 5 minutes than for 50 years.
Oh, absolutely. That's absolutely right. I mean, America has been known throughout all of its history as a nation of immigrants, and a generous country too. And, at times I still think back to the refugees that we took in during the Cold War years, people who were trying to escape, truly authoritarian regimes. It was never anything like what we're doing right now. This is insane. Those were considered programs, but, we took pride in the fact that we opened our arms at times to certain numbers of people to come and escape the misery of other parts of the world. That's my fear, is that, look, I totally understand and totally appreciate everyone's frustration with this at the moment. And that's my disappointment with what they have done the last 3 years, is not just the problems that they've caused in this country, but also just the cause of having a smart discussion about any of this.
Yeah. Okay. Final question, unless something else pops on our minds. I want to talk about, just going back to this journalism thing. I was reading today that 36% of Americans say they have no trust in the mainstream media. 78. Okay, so I guess this research group, which was Media Research Center study, they reviewed 600 news segments from July until whenever this was released, and they show 78% of news hits about Kamala Harris were positive, and 85% of news hits on Trump were negative, with ABC, CBS, NBC delivering the most unbalanced election coverage. How do these, it's like these groups complain that they're losing viewership, they're losing revenue because they're losing viewership, and yet it's like they lean into everything that would be bad for them. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this? Because I know with the Wall Street Journal, you guys, you try to be fair on both sides. You have writers with opinions on both sides. It's one thing I also like about Newsweek. They say, Donald Trump is the worst president ever, and then it says versus Donald Trump is the best president, and they try and give a balanced approach. How does the mainstream media redeem itself if they keep leaning into the echo chamber?
Well, so part of this, I truly believe, is that the line, if you go to the Wall Street Journal, anything that is an opinion that comes from the opinion side of the paper says opinion on it, right? And there is a divide between the news side of the paper that is there to provide news to people and the opinion side. And yes, I take pride within the opinion page, which is the part I work for. We try to get voices on all sides of the debate. We have a certain leaning, the editorial board itself, but in terms of the op-eds we write and our analysis of situations, we are not a partisan editorial page. We're a page that believes in free markets and free people. That's our motto. And so we sort of go after people with neither fear nor favor, but based on those principles. Are you upholding a system of free markets and free people? I think too many outlets have lost that line between an opinion people and news people. And you just open the news pages and there's opinion all over it because, they're just, the other thing, I read that study you're talking about, the Media Research Center study, and they made, I think, a very solid point, which is that a lot of the bias just comes from choosing the topics you're going to cover and that you're not going to cover. And they pointed out that those numbers are partly a reflection of the sort of nonstop media coverage of the supposed trials and difficulties and unpleasant aspects of Donald Trump, the courtroom stuff and the accusations, etc. Whereas most of the pieces about her were either about how she was doing in the race or why she's wowing Democratic audiences. And there was no real desire or drive to drill into any negative stories on her, right? Which is remarkable. This is a woman who, prior to being crowned the new nominee, in the space of about a week after Joe Biden said he was getting out, everybody in the media was like, she will be a disaster as a candidate. Everyone in the Democratic Party. She didn't suddenly become a masterful politician overnight. That reputation was deserved. Surely there's plenty to be writing about, concerns within her campaign about how she's performing and, her lack of ideas and her lack of an agenda. And what does it really mean that she won't disavow Joe Biden's policies at all? Could that have something to do with the fact that she looks like she might be losing? There's just not much of that. And if the media, I think that's clearly because the media does have a side in this, a lot of the media. And it's really, until they fix that, those credibility numbers and faith in that institution and my institution are not, the institution of journalism are not going to improve.
Yeah. So from a personal experience, I built my first 1 million subscribers on YouTube, having a neutral news channel. I tried to cover the economy. When it came to politics, I didn't really pick a side. I tried to say the good, the bad, and the ugly about both candidates last election cycle. But then once I saw how Joe Biden handled the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I remember like just being so agitated that I was like, I can't be neutral anymore. And I didn't mean to build a Donald Trump channel. I like Donald Trump. I don't personally have a problem with him, but from a business perspective, I wasn't trying to build that channel, right? But I'm only one person. I don't have an opinion person to bounce people off. And then I try to get people to come on from the other side. They don't want to, or the audience doesn't really want to hear from them. So it's just kind of interesting. I guess my point is like, even within my own life, I've seen this like narrowing down of finding what people want to hear. Another example of that is like now, if I do a video about Joe Biden, nobody's going to click because they don't care. They don't even know if he's president anymore. He's become the most irrelevant president I've ever seen, more than a lame duck president almost. And so, I go where the opportunity is. Kamala Harris, Trump, Vladimir Putin, Israel, the stories that people want to hear about. And next week, when the election's over, I'll go where people want me to go there. But I can see, I guess what I'm struggling with is like, should an organization just identify itself? Hey, we're left-leaning media, and just lean into that instead of pretending to be neutral? I don't know. I have mixed feelings about the whole thing.
Well, I do think that you make a really good point. Is that we've been talking about the Washington Post. Obviously, it leans one direction. I mean, when a newspaper adopts the logo "Democracy Dies in Darkness," it's certainly putting a certain stamp on its politics. I think that you're actually talking about two different things here. As we mentioned earlier in this podcast, there has been a rise in all kinds of alternative outlets for information, which I think is a great evolution. People often, they pine for the days when it was like the three networks. And I'm like, yes, I appreciate that Walter Cronkite was much more down the middle. But at the same time, if those three broadcasts weren't telling you what you needed to know, you didn't necessarily have a lot of other options for finding other things out. I think I'm a general believer in that more information is generally better. But with that comes a new obligation for viewers themselves to do some due diligence to make sure that they have trust in the people that they're talking to. I also think you bring up a bigger point, which you mentioned self-selection of the media that we consume these days. And I honestly believe we need to be doing a better job in our grade schools and high schools and junior highs in educating our kids about the need to engage civically and to also understand the need to consume news and opinions from, including ones that they don't want to hear. This is something, this self-selection media, it's very common. I remember actually, sometimes it's even unconscious. I got to teach an editorial writing class at Hillsdale a number of years ago. And I remember asking the young students in there, how do you get your news? And of course, no one subscribed to a newspaper. Which didn't necessarily floor me so much. But what did floor me is they said that really the only news that they read were stories that their friends sent to them via social media. So if you've got a certain friend group and they all think the same way, which is probably likely because you're hanging out with like-minded people, especially at that age, you're only going to hear one news line, one story subject. So I try to encourage my kids to read things that even make them uncomfortable, that they don't want to believe, that, they just challenges them somehow. And we all, as Americans, if we want to be, I think, savvy and engaged in the political process, have to challenge ourselves to listen to and watch some things and read some things that make us think outside of our comfort zone.
Yeah.
I do it every day.
I do too. I try to read both sides, and I'll try to come out. I'll give you an example. Okay. So there was a really left-leaning channel, and they said Donald Trump makes bombshell legal threat. And I was like, oh gosh, I need to know what this is, right? It was a good title. So I went over, I read it, and he was saying, hey, if I win and we find out that you were cheating in the election, you're going to jail, right? That was the video. And I was like, that's a great video, but I'm going to do it from the other side. Hey, wouldn't it be nice to have a president that holds people accountable? It's already against the law to cheat in an election, right? And so anyway, it was just like they were seeing it through a negative lens, and I was seeing it through a positive lens, even though it was the same material. I was trying to chew through it, but I tried to do that for my audience, where I try to read both sides and then say, hey, listen, here's what I think is happening in the middle. But then at the end of the day, they self-select. Do they want to hear it from Stephen Gardner, or do they want to hear it from Anderson Cooper, or do they want to hear it from somebody else? So anyway, I just think it's so interesting. We've never really lived in a time where we have so many independent voices, like Joe Rogan, for example. Right. I mean, that guy is an absolute beast when it comes to getting ears and eyeballs. And yet, people have to decide whether they want to hear the news, have it filtered through his brain, because that's the only way to get it is filtering it through his lens, his experience. Anyway, the news is an interesting industry. I'm sure you've enjoyed being in it for many years.
Well, I like to think that publications, and I say this about mine, that do try their very best to always be factually accurate and to report the news, are rewarded by loyal readers. And I think that is still a business model that very much exists out there. I think that, to the extent that some places are struggling, I mean, the newspaper world, as you well know, has been through all kinds of structural upheavals as well, too. The death of traditional advertising, the end, essentially, or increasingly, of print news, print newspaper, fewer printing plants out there to actually even get a real newspaper published and sent to people. The advent of real-time news, right? I mean, so much for the days when you had to wait for the paper to show up on your doorstep. You get your notifications on your phone, which does put an interesting stress on the news industry. Like, well, how do we still engage people if they're getting these notifications? How do we get them to come and spend time on our newspaper with our articles if it's not about kind of instant info? So there's been a lot of changes, but I do think that to the extent that there are some places that are struggling, it's in part because you have to make a commitment to that, and you've got to make your readers feel as though they're getting value, that they're getting accuracy. And that they're getting the sort of true story. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. It's always nice to have somebody on that I respect, that I find very intelligent, very experienced, and that's you. So I know it's a lot for you to take time out of your day with everything going on. If people want to follow you online or get that weekly newsletter, what links can I share down below?
Oh, well, I will get them to you offline. But yes, the newsletter is a new thing. And it's coming out on Wednesday mornings. And then that's in addition to my column that comes out on Fridays in the paper.
Okay, great. Well, I'll put those links down below. Kim Strassel, thank you so much for coming on. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. I love being on the podcast.